he tweeted this out, this clip that we're about to watch. He said this was him addressing the European Union Parliament. He also said that that had gone viral. I mean, I guess to be fair, this wasn't his tweet. It was but it was clearly he wrote it. It was the description of the YouTube video. And at the time he said that it had 50,000 views. It's like, okay, if that's viral, I mean, there are GTAA clips that have done better than that, right? So whatever. But I think on further investigation, I don't think he's actually speaking to the European Parliament. I think he's speaking to a conference that was held by a far right party that was around maybe it used some of their facilities or something, but it wasn't like he was addressing a session. But this is all nitpicking. Let's get to his insights. Jake, do we have the Lindsay clip?
He writes about this exclusively in the 1840s, very deeply. How do we do this? And he looks at the economic conditions and he says, this is where it is. And that's why we get economic Marxism. And that's why we think Marx was an economist. But Marx was never an economist. He was a theologian. He wanted to produce a religion for mankind that would supersede all of the religions of mankind and bring him back to his true social nature. And this is the true fact of Marx. And what the goal was, like I said, was to complete man. So what he said is, well, how are we building man currently? All of his economic analysis is about how are we building man at present through what he called material determinism. And he said, well, what we have is a special form of private property in our society. Our society is organized around private property. And so all of our thoughts organize around private property. In other words, there's a special kind of property that the bourgeois elite class has access to, and then they organize society to exclude everybody else from access to that property through exploitation, through alienation, through estrangement, through oppression. And so what Karl Marx was proposing is that economics becomes a vehicle to separate society into a bourgeois class that has access to a special form of property. The people who have access wish to retain that, so they oppress people and keep other people out of that special form of property. They erect a system of classism to do that. It's enforced by an ideology called capitalism that believes that this is the right way to engage in the world. And what we have to do is awaken the underclass, the proletariat, to the real conditions and the fact that they are historical agents of change, and bring them to do a revolution and transform society so that we would have equity or socialism, whichever word you want. They have the same definition.
Marx, well-known Christian humanist, right? Just fucking thick as a prick. I have no words for that.
Yeah, I mean, so I should say for anybody, I mean, you're on this show a lot. I think most people know, but if anybody is seeing you for the first time, you teach political theory classes at the University of Michigan. You've certainly assigned Marx many times. So if a student wrote a paper and they said this, let's what are some of the main things you think that they might be missing here?
Well, there's a lot to be said about this, right? First off is that Lindsay isn't really saying anything that's even new. So his attempt to kind of present himself as cutting edge right-wing intellectual is really disingenuous. This thesis was articulated a lot better by a man named Eric Voegelin in the mid-century, where he essentially argued that pretty much every flavor of progressivism that you can imagine is an iteration of Gnostic theology. What Lindsay doesn't pick up from this is, of course, that liberalism, especially American liberalism, falls within that category also, since Voegelin also saw liberalism as essentially a progressive doctrine. So there's a bad failure there to acknowledge the antecedents to your own viewpoint, which really is pretty shocking when you consider that this is supposed to be an apparently learned right-wing figure, and he's not really even aware of somebody who's really foundational to a lot of the more sophisticated analyses of the political left that have been launched by a variety of different conservatives since the mid-century. But on the more substantive point about what Marx was getting at, Marx was really very clear, particularly in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, about what he thought about religion, right? And it's more complicated than some of the more militantly atheistic Marxists will put forward, but it's very clearly a kind of endorsement of secularism, right? So he characterized religion as the opiate of the masses, famously. But then he gives a bit more of a benign, even kind of charitable interpretation of it as the heart of a heartless world, right? And the essential argument of Marx is that as long as, and his early, more humanist phase, as long as the social relations within any given historical society are fundamentally alienating, people are going to seek solace by projecting some eternal realm out there that will both explain their misery in this life and console themselves that something better awaits them. And this is actually quite a sophisticated view, if you think about it. Compare it to, say, somebody like Richard Dawkins, right? Because Marx would say, look, the problem with these kind of Dawkinian atheists is that they just say, look, there is no God, stop believing in it, and kind of move on with your life. And Marx would say, look, as long as there are very, very clear forms of alienation present in your society, people are going to turn to one religion or another, right? Because it's the only way that they can deal with the trauma that is deeply baked in to any number of exploitative and alienating social relations, which include, those that antecede capitalism. And then later on in his work, this is what's most baffling about this. Marx very clearly turned to political economy as the primary lens through which he thought he could critique the contemporary social form and suggest what kind of alternative might be open on the long-term horizon. And this is why trying to say like Marx was not an economist is just such a baffling viewpoint, right? Now, you can critique elements of Marx's political economy. I, for instance, have a deep skepticism about at least certain vulgar iterations of the Marxist labor theory of value. I tend to see it as a kind of a historical law rather than one that's trans-historical, but we don't need to get into that. It's very clear that Marx took his day job, let's put it this, as a political economist very seriously, right? If you read something like the Grundrisse or Theories of Surplus Value, he was deeply engaged with Ricardo, Smith, J.S. Mill, James Mill for that matter, hated Malthus, wrote extensively about him. Das Kapital obviously launches a critique of the categories of bourgeois political economy while also acknowledging their relative plausibility within a certain historical horizon. And then for the rest of his life, he worked on the last two volumes of Capital, which includes lengthy digressions on everything from fictitious capital to the famous Trinity formula, which is what's necessary in order to get the whole system going, notes on what a speculative financial system might bring about. I mean, economics is absolutely integral to Marxism. And to just kind of brush it aside by saying, no, this is all theology is really not just baffling, but pretty lazy, which I think is going to be the operative word I'll come back to for the rest of the night.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. So to that, I would add that it is really telling that Lindsay uses this word that, two words in there that, could not be more foreign to Marx's thought, not just because they're very 21st century kinds of buzzwords, but because they're content, right? One is classism, and the other is equity, and he also said something really interesting, where it's like, an ideology called capitalism. It's like capitalism, certainly Marx's understanding, is not an ideology. There's obviously this pro-capitalist ideology, but, capitalism is a, mode of production and an economic system, like a way of organizing property relations. And so but again, the fact that Lindsay can't even comprehend people sort of caring about anything but ideology, I think is super revealing in and of itself. And I think it also shows where his head is at, that, he talks about classism. Classism is a word that might be used by liberals who can't imagine that, it's like, okay, all right, people want to, people say that we should care about class, and that sounds somehow analogous to how we should care about race or other things. So it's like, what they must be talking about is class-based prejudice, which has absolutely nothing to do with it. It's not Marx, Marx is not concerned about people thinking badly about workers. He's concerned about society being divided into, classes of workers and capitalists in the first place. And equity is, really, I mean, it's not a very well-defined term, honestly. Matt Bruning had a good article about this there was in Jacobin a while back. But, like, every time I ever see anybody talk about equity, what they really seem to be talking about is some form of equality of opportunity, which I think is, again, I think it's very telling that, like, even when you're trying to figure out what Marx is saying, if you're still thinking in terms of, who has like a leg up, or like, does everybody have really equal opportunity for the purposes of upward mobility, which I think could not miss the point more badly about the sort of, objecting to class society versus just wanting to make it easier for people to change classes.
No, absolutely. And I think this emphasis on Marx class-oriented analysis is really demonstrative of a very common trope on the political right, which is to essentially invert the causality of progressive arguments. So it's not the fact that we live in a class-ridden society with a lot of animosity that exists, which is the basis of social problems, right? The problem is that leftists keep on pointing out that we live in a class-ridden society, and if they were just to shut up about that, then everything would be absolutely a-okay, and we wouldn't need to do anything to actually deal with these animosities, right? You can see examples of this kind of inversion of causality everywhere, right? But I'd like to point out something that really bugs me about this, beyond just the fact that this is very, very, very stock and trade stuff for the political right, which is that this kind of insinuation that Marx is the one who developed a class-oriented approach to society is just absolutely bogus, right? I mean, go read Aristotle's Politics. He's very, very clear there that there's a class-oriented dimension to every society that he sees before. And in fact, what kind of government you're going to have in the world of antiquity is really going to be dependent upon which class is going to be in power, right? Whether it's the aristocracy, the monarchy, or the demos, ruled by the many. And he says, what type of government you have and what kind of class is going to be in charge will also shape what kind of policies you're going to initiate. So there you go. Maybe Aristotle was a Marxist, which Marx himself might agree with. But if you don't like something going that far back, all you need to do is read well-known, socialist James Madison, right, and Federalist 10, where he sits there and he's like, listen, there are a diverse array of faculties for acquiring property. The preservation of those faculties is one of the first objects of government, and precisely because these faculties are unequal and unequal accumulations of property attenuate, government is also going to be riven by faction, and sometimes Madison sounds quite a bit like a Marxist, but an inverse Marxist, where he says, since there's perennially going to be factions that emerge as a result of these disparities in property, government should take the side of, guess who? The rich in the United States. Because, of course, we can't have the plebs getting too up in arms about these things, since they don't deserve to have what their betters have acquired from them. So I guess James Madison was a Marxist before his time, because he's focused on class analyses. And there are just innumerable examples of this. And that's not to downplay Marx's originality as a theorist of class. I think that Marx generated a very interesting account of class. But again, it's just another attempt to kind of suggest that if only Marx didn't exist, all these problems would go away. We'd all live in harmony. All the migrants would go back to their place, and we'd have miniature American flags all over the place. It's a kind of fantastic worldview. And it's time for people to wake up and realize that it's never going to be that way, because as long as you don't actually solve the problems that Marx detected, you're perennially going to get people who will get pissed off about them.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.